The Battle of Ilovaisk, August 18th, 2014. Ukrainian troops involved. The Ukrainian troops involved in the Battle of Ilovaisk consisted of the Dnipro 2 Battalion, the Donbas Battalion, and the Azov, or Ukrainian National Guard Battalion. The Russian troops. The Russian troops involved were the Donbas People's Militia, a pro-Russian rebel group. In 2014, the town of Ilovaisk was taken over by a group of Russian rebels known as the Donbas People's Militia. On the 18th of August, Ukrainian National Guard and Ukrainian military troops moved to surround the town. The ensuing battle would be known as the Battle of Ilovaisk. The first stage. In the late hours of August 18th, Ukrainian troops would begin their push in the town of Ilovaisk. The first troops to make contact with Russian rebels would be the Donbas Battalion on the southern front. This battalion would consist of 1 T-64, 1 BMP-2, 1 BTR-80, 4 BTR-RDs, and 8 Humvees. These troops would find themselves engaging technical trucks with heavy machine guns. As the Ukrainian troops engaged, they knocked out both technical trucks and began to engage infantry surrounding the roadblock. As the Donbas Battalion engaged the southern roadblock, they were surprised to find the rebels could barely hold them off. The rebels were ill-equipped and were not ready to face the Ukrainian army. On the northern front, the Azov Battalion was fast approaching their roadblock. The Azov Battalion consisted of the same amount of troops as the Donbas Battalion. When the Ukrainians began to engage the roadblocks, the rebels could not take out the tanks that had accompanied the Ukrainian mechanized infantry. This resulted in the roadblocks being almost immediately wiped out. As the Ukrainian troops, tanks, infantry began to roll through the roadblock, the rebels could barely do anything, as their Kalashnikov assault rifles could not penetrate the armor on most of the Ukrainian vehicles. As the Ukrainians on the northern front began to take out the roadblock, they also realized that the rebels were very weak. On the western front, the Dnipro Battalion consisted of the same amount of troops as both the other battalions. As the Dnipro Battalion approached the roadblock, they realized that the roadblock the rebels had set up was on much flatter terrain. This allowed for the Ukrainians to engage the roadblock at farther distances, hindering the rebels' capacity to attack. The roadblocks on all three fronts were set up almost exactly the same, due to the rebels having minimal equipment and vehicles. Once the Ukrainian troops had taken out the technicals, they began their advance to take out the rest of the infantry. The rebel infantry could do almost nothing to hinder their advance. As the Dnipro Battalion finished knocking out its roadblock, it had gone in contact with two other battalions and formed a rallying point in the center of the town. Over on the northern front, Azov Battalion had encountered more resistance than expected. This was due to the terrain that they were fighting in being hilly and forested. The rebels could hide their vehicles and themselves easily within this area. The road leading to the town on the northern front was also a choke point for the rebels. The Ukrainian troops had to cross a bridge that led directly into an ambush. The only way the Ukrainian troops survived was due to their heavy armor support. Sadly though, not all Ukrainian troops survived. Most had died on the northern front due to the choke point. Casualty reports from the northern front indicated heavy losses. 1 BMP-2, 1 BTR-80, and 2 Humvees were lost from Azov Battalion on the northern front. The resulting casualties were 24 troops losing their lives. The Russian militia, on the other hand, lost or had all their troops captured by the Ukrainians. On the southern front, the Donbas Battalion had fared much better. but only lost one BTR-80, which resulted in 7 troops losing their lives. As for the Russian militia, they were all wiped out. On the Western Front, the Dnipro Battalion had the best casualty report because the terrain they fought in was in Ukrainian favor. Dnipro Battalion had no troops lost and had wiped out all of the Russian militia at their checkpoint. This was due to the flat terrain and the ability of the Ukrainian tanks to shoot at farther distances than the Russian rebels' machine guns. Once the rebel checkpoints had been knocked out, all 3 battalions would link up and prepare for Phase 2.
Part 2, the fortification. As Ukrainian troops met up in the center of town, they devised a plan to fortify the town for the oncoming Russian assault. All 3 divisions set up different defensive locations near where they had entered. Once the Ukrainian vehicles had arrived at their location, the mechanized infantry dismounted and began to prepare for the incoming counterattack. Sadly though, the Ukrainians would not be prepared for what was coming. Part 3, Russian Assault. The Ukrainian troops involved in this defense would be the Azov Battalion, Ukrainian National Guard, the Donbas Battalion, and the Dnipro II Battalion. The Russian troops involved in this assault would be the 6th Tank Brigade, the 8th Motor Rifle Brigade, and the 21st Motor Rifle Brigade. The Ukrainian defense would be set up on the inner perimeter of the city, which would allow them to use the buildings to their advantage. The 8th Motor Rifle Brigade attacked from the west, while the 21st Motor Rifle Brigade attacked from the north, and the 6th Tank Brigade attacked from the south. The first contact would be made from the 8th Motor Rifle Brigade in the west, in which they found themselves attacking mixed defenders from all 3 battalions inside the town. Heavy machine gun fire first rang out early August 19th, as the 8th Motor Rifle Brigade began to advance on the defenders. Ukrainian infantry and tanks were no match for the modern Russian tanks and vehicles. For example, the Russians were using modern T-72B3 tanks. As the Russians advanced to the west to begin the battle, the 21st Motor Rifle Brigade in the north began to advance on the defenders. First contact with the Russians was made by light infantry and Humvees from the Ukrainian mixed defenders. The vehicles the Ukrainians were using were no match against the modern Russian tanks and IFVs. The outdated tanks that Ukraine deployed were not able to penetrate the Russian tank armor, resulting in them being immediately wiped out. As the Russians advanced in the north, the Ukrainian defenders began to understand the situation they were in. Over in the south, the Russians had just made contact with the Ukrainian defenders, and the battle soon began. As Russian armor and infantry fighting vehicles rolled along the road leading into the city, the Ukrainians began to prepare for the onslaught they would have to encounter. During this time, they radioed for reinforcements from the neighboring 92nd Mechanized Division. Sadly, the reinforcements would arrive too late. Once the Russians entered the town, the Ukrainians began to engage the tanks. Unfortunately for them, the Russian tanks were using explosive reactive armor, ERA for short, which countered their tow missiles, RPGs, and tank rounds. The resulting battle was a bloodbath for the Ukrainian defenders on the flat terrain in which they were positioned, playing out almost exactly like the Ukrainians' assault on the southern checkpoint. Once the 6th Tank Brigade had begun to enter the town and engage the Ukrainians, the northern defenders had almost been entirely wiped out, due to the fact that the western attackers could also engage the northern defenders. Once the 6th Tank Brigade had begun to enter the town and engage the Ukrainians, the northern defenders had almost been entirely wiped out, due to the fact that the western attackers could also engage the northern defenders. The only thing that Ukrainians could possibly do was hide from the remaining tanks as they rolled into town, and once the tanks had passed, the Ukrainians could possibly retreat to their last fighting position inside the town. Once the Russian tanks had come off the bridge and arrived on flat ground, the Ukrainian troops were cut down by machine guns. The northern front had fallen, and the Russians were now pushing into the town. With the northern front being taken out, the troops from the 21st Motor Rifle Brigade began to advance into the center of town. As this was happening, the 8th Motor Rifle Brigade began to engage in the heaviest fighting yet. The Ukrainian troops had a better position to ambush the 8th Motor Rifle Brigade and had positioned their BMP in a spot where the Russians couldn't see it, but it could see them. This allowed it to take on multiple Russian vehicles before being knocked out itself. As the Western Front put up an amazing fight and knocked out multiple Russian vehicles, the Southern Front had been absolutely obliterated. They had no cover, minimal troops, and little to no anti-armor capabilities. All units from the Southern Front would be wiped out and the Russians would take 0 casualties. Once the fighting had died down and the Russians began to advance into the center of town, the Ukrainians would form their final holding place near the crossroads. They would hold out until further reinforcements could come. Ukraine had lost 95% of its troops, and the Russians had lost only 1 BTR-82 and 2 BMP-2s. This was a true show of modern military capabilities.
Part 4. Reinforcements. Ukrainian troops involved. The Ukrainian troops involved would be the 92nd Mechanized Brigade. Russian troops involved. The Russian troops involved would be the 6th Tank Brigade. Late August, the reinforcements requested earlier the previous day would arrive. They would arrive in form of the 92nd Mechanized Brigade. They would advance from the south. Unknown to them, the Russians knew they were coming. As they advanced hastily, the Russians prepared their defenses. The 92nd Brigade had multiple vehicles, including BTR-80s, Humvees, tow missiles, and Russian scout cars. Sadly, they would not have any heavy armor assets with them. As they advanced towards the attackers, they got bogged down in the terrain. This would give the Russians more time to prepare. Once they began engaging the Russians, multiple troop transports on the Russian side were knocked out. Those troop transports had no troops in them and were decoys that were laid to set a trap. Ukrainian troops barely got into the outskirts of the city before they got engaged by heavy machine guns and tanks. Ukraine would knock out a total of 3 troop transports before they began to get knocked out. Once the Ukrainians had made it into the town, they began to get picked off by BMPs and tanks. They could barely make it past the outer road in the city before they were wiped out. The remaining reinforcements tried to flee, but were trapped by blown-up vehicles on the bridge, which resulted in them having to surrender or being captured. This was yet another Ukrainian bloodbath. Once the reinforcements had been knocked out, the remaining troops inside the city had to make a decision. Part 5. Retreat. The remaining 5 troops and 1 Humvee inside the city would try to make a final escape to get back to Ukrainian lines. They would barely make it out before the Russian advance on their position. The Battle of Ilovaisk was over, with thousands wounded and dead, and a whole entire city destroyed. The Ukrainians would later recapture it in the following months of conflict.
What's wrong with the world, mama? People fight and think the world's gone cold, mama. People dying when alone in their homes, God. Innocent people take their lives as it's a joke now. And overseas got the bosses doing talks now. But we still got murder in the big towns of Ukraine. Help Ukraine. The bombs and the guns and the World War III. Could they only just stop and think about this? What are the messages they're teaching their young kids? Violence is the way to sort their problems out. Meanwhile the soldiers in the streets getting gunned down. Coronavirus taught the world to stick together. And if we'll ever know if we can get through whatever, pray for Russia, pray for Ukraine and whoever. God, if only we can love enough to make this all better. People killing, people dying, children hurt, can you hear them crying? Can you practice what you preach if you turn the other cheek?